News now at 6 from Cleveland's St. Clair-Superior neighborhood. That's where Cleveland EMS confirms a 15-year-old boy was shot in the head and rushed.
2 men found shot downtown, and Cleveland police say they are investigating. This comes as we are digging up new information.
This morning, we just got new details on an overnight shooting that happened in downtown Cleveland. Our Kier.
1 in 14. That's your chance of becoming a crime victim if you live in Street Clair-Superior right now. We're not talking about some war-torn country overseas. This is Cleveland, Ohio, less than 3 miles from downtown, sitting right next to Lake Erie. And here's what the city hopes you never dig into. This neighborhood records 21.04 violent crimes per 1,000 residents in 2025. That's 551% higher than the national average. Let that sink in for a second. But here's where it gets worse. Street Clair-Superior ranks in the first percentile for safety nationwide. The absolute bottom. For every violent crime that happens in an average American neighborhood, 5.5 happen here. And we're not even talking about property crime yet. That's sitting at 47.5 per 100,000 residents, which is 297% above average. The total annual cost, $4,972 per resident, just from crime alone. For a neighborhood of roughly 5,000 people, that's $5 million in violent crime costs every single year. Now, let's break down what those numbers actually mean on the streets. Assaults happen at a rate of 4.98 per 1,000 residents. That's 498% higher than what's normal. Robberies clock in at 0.79 per 1,000, and they jumped 15% just from 2024 to 2025. Homicides, 0.51 per 1,000, putting the neighborhood in the 4th percentile for safety. Seasoned pros who track crime patterns know this. The center of the neighborhood sees 19 violent incidents annually, while the northwest section sees just 1. That concentration tells you everything about how gang territory works here. Here's the part they don't advertise. 25% of properties sit vacant. Empty houses become crash pads for drug operations, squats for gangs, and dead zones where 40% of streets lack proper lighting. You're not just dealing with crime statistics, you're dealing with infrastructure designed to hide criminals. This neighborhood wasn't always a war zone. In 1880, Street Clair-Superior was where America's industrial dream actually worked. Foundries, ironworks, and tube factories lined the Lake Erie coast, pulling in European immigrants by the thousands. Slovenians, Croatians, Poles, Hungarians, they all came for one reason: jobs that actually paid. By 1920, over 20,000 people called this place home, living in workers' housing along Street Clair Avenue, building churches like Street Vitus, and keeping old world traditions alive with festivals like Kurintovanje. The solidarity was real back then. Neighbors knew each other, watched out for each other's kids, shared food when times got tight. Small businesses thrived because factory workers had paychecks to spend. The community had purpose, identity, and most importantly, economic stability. That's what kept crime low, not some magical sense of morality. People had too much to lose. Then World War II ended, and everything started cracking. Veterans came home, suburbs exploded outward, and the term white flight became Cleveland's reality. European families who'd built Street Clair-Superior packed up and moved to newer housing developments with lawns and garages. Within 2 decades, the neighborhood shifted from majority white European to majority African American. That demographic change alone wouldn't have destroyed anything, but it happened right as factories started closing. Global competition killed Cleveland's industrial base. Automation eliminated jobs that used to require human hands. Between 1,950 and 1,980, this neighborhood lost 70 to 80% of its manufacturing employment. Thousands of jobs gone. The 1,966 Huff riots nearby didn't help. Racial tensions were already simmering. An economic collapse turned that simmer into a boil. By 1990, the cycle was locked in. Poverty led to property abandonment, which led to increased crime, which drove out anyone who could afford to leave. The population bled out from 20,000 to barely 10,000, and it kept falling. If the post-war era cracked Street Clair-Superior's foundation, the 2007 housing crisis bulldozed whatever was left standing. Foreclosure rates hit 30 to 40%. Read that again, nearly half of homeowners lost their properties. Hundreds of houses sat empty almost overnight, And when a house sits empty in a neighborhood already struggling, it doesn't stay empty for long. Squatters moved in. Drug dealers set up shop. Vandals stripped copper wiring, plumbing, anything with resale value. By 2020, the population had crashed to under 5,000 residents. The poverty rate hit 45%, compared to Cleveland's already high 30%. Unemployment sat at 15%, and basic services started disappearing. Banks closed branches because there wasn't enough money moving through the neighborhood to justify staying. Clinics shut down. Even grocery stores pulled out, creating food deserts where residents had to travel miles for fresh produce. Here's what the professionals know. Street Clair-Superior Coalition was founded back in 1976, followed by the Development Corporation in 1980. Both organizations have been fighting to rehabilitate this neighborhood for nearly 50 years. They've pushed community projects, secured some funding, kept hope alive when almost no one else cared. But they were fighting economic forces way beyond their control: global markets, federal housing policy, regional industrial collapse. By the time 2020 rolled around, the damage was so deep that recovery seemed impossible. The data tells the brutal story. Deserted properties now make up 25% of the neighborhood. That's 1,250 empty buildings, serving as infrastructure for criminal activity. Streets remain dark because the city hasn't invested in lighting. 40% of the neighborhood becomes a no man's land after sunset. And while other Cleveland neighborhoods started stabilizing in the 2010 seconds, Street Clair-Superior kept sinking. The question everyone started asking wasn't, can this neighborhood recover? It was, is there anything left to recover? Let's talk about how crime actually functions as an economy here, because that's exactly what it is. Those 1,250 vacant properties, they're not just eyesores, they're operational bases. Drug dealers use them as stash houses. Gangs claim them as territory markers. Squatters set up semi-permanent camps inside, creating neighborhoods within the neighborhood that police can barely monitor. When you've got 25% of your housing stock serving criminal purposes, you're not dealing with a crime problem, you're dealing with a parallel economy. The numbers back this up. Assaults dominate the violent crime statistics at 98 per 1,000 residents. And seasoned crime analysts know what that signals: gang territory disputes. When assault rates run that high compared to other violent crimes, it means groups are fighting over control of specific blocks, specific houses, specific drug corners. Robberies increased 15% from 2024 to 2025, which tracks with economic desperation getting worse, not better. And shootings linked to gang activity jumped 10% in 2025 alone, even as Cleveland's overall crime rate started dropping. Here's the insider truth. Proximity to downtown Cleveland creates a unique problem. Tourists and business people wandering just a few blocks too far become easy targets. The neighborhood sits close enough to the city center that criminals can operate and disappear quickly, but far enough that police response times lag. It's a geographic sweet spot for predatory crime, and everyone working these streets knows it. Then you've got the infrastructure problem multiplying everything. 40% of streets lack adequate lighting, which means large sections of the neighborhood become functionally lawless after dark. No banks means no legitimate financial services, pushing residents toward check-cashing joints that charge predatory fees, or worse, toward underground lending with violent enforcement. No clinics means medical emergencies require traveling to other neighborhoods, and those delays cost lives. When basic services disappear, the vacuum gets filled by whatever's willing to operate in the darkness. Usually, that's not anything good. But here's what they don't want you dwelling on. Money is finally flowing into street. Clair-Superior. And we're not talking pocket change. The Mandel Foundation committed over $20 million across 3 years, from 2023 to 2026. This isn't charity, it's a calculated bet that infrastructure investment can break the crime cycle. Let's break down where that money's actually going, because the details matter. $725,000 went to Land Studio for placemaking and public art projects. The idea? Make the neighborhood visually appealing enough that people want to be there, which creates natural surveillance and pushes out criminal activity. Another $8 million is rebuilding Gordon Park on the lakefront, turning it from an abandoned mess into an actual recreational space. Then there's $5 million for the Mandel Community Trail, a 2.7-mile pathway connecting different sections of the neighborhood. Construction kicks off in May 2025. Add $3 million for a sailing and boating center on the Lake Erie shore, and another $5.1 million extending the trail system. And you've got infrastructure that could genuinely change how the neighborhood functions. Here's the theory professionals use: natural surveillance. When you create trails, parks, and gathering spaces that people actually use, crime drops because criminals hate witnesses. Studies show this kind of infrastructure can reduce crime by 15 to 20%. Gordon Park already saw a 40% reduction in incidents during Q1 2025 compared to Q1 2024, and that's with construction still ongoing. The trail system aims to eliminate those dark, isolated blocks where 40% of streets currently lack lighting. But Mandel's investment is just part of the story. The Street Clair-Superior Development Corporation, Land Studio, and Mandel Foundation are collaborating on a comprehensive community development plan targeting 2024 to 2025. They've identified 3 strategic nodes: West Gateway, East Gateway, and Civic Crossroads. Each node gets specific interventions: bike lanes, improved street lighting, mixed-use development. They're planning 20 modular homes as a pilot program launching in 2026, trying to fill vacant lots with actual residents. They're converting old industrial buildings into lofts, betting that new housing will attract people who can afford to live anywhere but choose to invest here. And they're building the neighborhood's first satellite police station in 15 years. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Community surveys from 2024 show gentrification is the #1 concern among current residents. Over 500 people gave input, and they're not stupid. They've seen this movie before. Improvements come in, property values rise, rents jump 40 to 60%, and suddenly the people who survive the worst years can't afford to stay. Boston's Nubian Square followed that exact script. Pittsburgh's Larimer neighborhood recovered but lost 30% of its original population. The question isn't whether investment helps, it's who actually benefits. Street Clair-Superior's poverty rate sits at 48%. These aren't people with financial buffers. When you start converting industrial buildings into lofts and building sailing centers on the lakefront, you're not building for folks making minimum wage. The Mandel Foundation promises to preserve multiculturalism without gentrification, but there's no clear mechanism for how that actually works. Affordable housing requirements, rent control, community land trusts. The plans mention vague goals but lack enforcement teeth. And then there's the brutal math. $20 million. Sounds huge, but Cleveland's municipal budget runs over $2 billion annually. This neighborhood needs an estimated $50 million minimum to reverse 40 years of systematic decline, and that's a conservative figure from development analysts. Current investment covers less than half of what's required. The timeline makes it worse. Infrastructure projects take 3 to 5 years to show measurable results. If crime doesn't drop quickly, investors lose confidence and pull funding before the cycle completes. Meanwhile, the criminal infrastructure remains untouched. Those 1,250 vacant properties don't disappear because you built a bike trail. Gang shootings increased 10% in 2025 despite all these development plans. One satellite police station covering 2 square miles isn't enough to disrupt operations that have been entrenched for decades. And here's the uncomfortable truth. There's zero allocation for education in the Mandel Plan. No funds for youth programs, no job training initiatives beyond the 50 entrepreneur goal, no reintegration support for ex-convicts who return to the neighborhood. You're treating symptoms while the disease keeps spreading. Let's cut through the corporate language and talk about what recovery actually requires, because nobody wants to say it out loud. Cleveland let this neighborhood collapse over 4 decades. The population dropped from 20,000 to 5,000, while downtown received over $500 million in development funding. That's not an accident, that's policy. City leadership made calculated decisions about which neighborhoods deserved investment and which ones could be written off. Street Clair-Superior got written off. Now we're supposed to celebrate $20 million in some public art? The Mandel Foundation deserves credit for stepping up when government wouldn't. But let's be honest about the contradictions here. $725,000 for placemaking and art installations could fund 50 full-time jobs for 2 years at $28,000 annually. The city celebrates multiculturalism while residents flee violence. They promise preservation while planning developments that current residents can't afford. It's the same playbook every gentrifying neighborhood follows: improve it, price out the poor, call it progress. Here's what professionals know works based on successful urban recovery models. Direct investment in education and employment, not trails and murals. Cleveland spends roughly $40,000 per year per prisoner, but allocates virtually nothing for reintegration programs. Federal Job Corps programs have proven success rates, but Cleveland doesn't implement them here. The city could legally seize those 1,250 zombie properties tomorrow through existing nuisance laws and convert them into affordable housing or green space. But it doesn't. Why? Because political will doesn't exist. Real community policing requires more than a satellite station. It requires officers who live in the neighborhood, who know residents by name, who have investment in the community's success. That costs money and requires systemic change in how police departments operate. Nobody wants to fund that. Rent stabilization and community land trusts could prevent displacement, but those policies threaten real estate profits, so they never gain traction. The debate breaks into three positions. Position 1, $20 million is a necessary start. Results take time. Have patience. Position 2, investment is insufficient without addressing root causes of unemployment and lack of education. Position 3, gentrification is inevitable, so accept it and compensate displaced residents. My take? You can't paint murals over bullets. Without legitimate employment, improved education, and actual social services, you're just moving crime to the next forgotten neighborhood. And honestly, asking why Cleveland's most dangerous neighborhood only gets $20 million when the city has a $2 billion budget tells you everything about how much they actually care. How many street Clair-Superiors exist in your city ignored the exact same way?